In this video, I'm going to show you my digital inking process, what goes into it, and how I approach my pages. This was a request from the comments in my last video. If you have anything you would like to see or would like me to talk about, drop it in the comments and I'll give it a good chew. When I work on chapter 21 of Scatheless, I plan on recording a spread from completely blank. It won't have to be sped up as much as this one, as a rough draft doesn't take 12 hours to scribble out. This spread took about 12 hours to ink, so I've sped it up 1,000%, and it's still a long process. So I hope you'll stick around with me and see how this blue mess ends up. Before I dive into the process, the pages are set up. The script is divided into text prompts, and a rough blue scribbly version is hewn from it. The prompt for this spread was, quote, Aiden and the others are nearly run over by the fairies. Kara sees Fionne's lifeless body sinking down to the ground and screams his name. A fairy attacks her while she's distracted, trying to bite off her head, but Aiden, in an attempt to save her, suddenly impales it with his weapons. He seems surprised too, looking at its hands and then up at the others. Puka, next to him, suddenly grows bigger, more threatening, like a wild monster from a nightmare. The fairies hesitantly retreat a few steps. Eve, Aiden, your magic is back, end quote. I decided to leave the bit about Puka for another page. I felt it needed more space and could look really cool and be more impactful by itself. I mean, the next passage essentially repeats the part about Puka with a request for a, quote, really cool panel. So it made sense to combine them and let this one focus on the fairies, Kara, and Aiden. So right away, my pages are set up to be print ready. All the margins and guide boxes are in place. I have a video that goes over this process, and you need to do it first, absolutely first. If your margins, safe zone, and bleed are there, you can place your panels and text bubbles appropriately the first time. If you're working traditionally, deleter paper has the print markings on it in blue, and even includes markings for suggested gutters and gutter widths, though I've found the markings are the same as each other, so they're not narrow enough for the vertical gutters and not wide enough for the horizontal ones, so you kind of have to play with it a little bit. Though ultimately, for mine, I read it digitally anyway, so it ended up not mattering. And I've noticed in manga, as I said, the vertical gutters tend to be really narrow, in a way connecting the panels together, and the wide horizontal gutters give your eye a clear break and denote a separation, almost forcing your eye to go across before going down. The placement of your panels is important. If they are confusing, you can't tell the story effectively. And if it's bad enough, the reader may just stop reading and leave. I mean, I do that all the time. It's worth taking the time at the beginning to consider your panel layout and what is placed where. Personally, I prefer working with a lower page count. I like the space, the way it flows, the reduced possibility of confusion than lots of little bitty panels. But I'll use them from time to time if the moment calls for it and when I want things to move more quickly. Chapter 1 of Scatheless was about 30 or so pages, up from the planned 20 because of this decompression, and a few double spreads that I insisted on. I always work in spreads, as this is how your reader will experience the story. Manga is traditionally consumed in book form and thus relies on page turns and spreads. Working on the entire spread, especially in the rough draft stage, will allow you to consider the composition of the entire thing. The entire piece, both pages. The flow, the panel placement, the bubble arrangement, the gutters, and guiding the eye visually from the top right corner of the first page all the way to the bottom left-hand corner of the second page and into the page turn. It's much easier to achieve this effect when you work in a spread than one page at a time, unless you're doing webtoon, but that's an entirely different situation. If when greeted by a scary blank page, and I'm not sure what panels I want to use, I'll arbitrarily divide the spread horizontally into 3. Unless there's a super wide panel, the gutters won't go directly across both in the end. That's weird and confusing. And it, to me, looks wrong. But it gives us somewhere to start, especially if I'm intimidated by the coming page. I was intimidated by this page, but we'll get to that. Once the process has started, I can move around, eliminate, and subdivide these 3 long boxes. And remember, once they turn the page, your reader will experience the whole thing at once, before then slowly picking through the trail of breadcrumbs you've left. So really, you have to consider both. Okay, this page. When I was almost done with chapter 20, After seeing that comment, I decided to record the last spread I had to do. I don't work in order, so it's not actually the last spread of the chapter, just the one I pushed off until last. At any rate, I thought, why not try out the request made earlier? Let's record it and see where we go, see what happens. And it turned out to be a 12-hour recording. For a page with all this detail and fiddliness, it takes a long time. Many pages will take an average of 4 hours, so these took 6. I sped it up considerably, and even at 1,000% speed, it ended up being over an hour, or about an hour long. Any faster than that, and maybe even at this speed, the drawing process starts to get lost. So, but let's hang out for a bit and talk about it. And when I opened it, I was like, oh, it's that spread. It's the fairy spread. I hate fairy spreads. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was the dummy who designed them visually. It's my own fault, and I mean, the fairies look fun, but pages full of them intimidate me. They have a lot of scratchy, funny little details, and they're kind of weird looking, and honestly, often I'm not even sure what to do with them. I mean, on my rough draft, they're just little balls with ears scattered around, like, oh, there's a fairy over here, and a fairy over there, and one here, and one there, and we'll figure it out later. It's a lot, and I get overwhelmed thinking about it. So apparently I put this one off to last, and here we are. But luckily this is digital, thank God. So when I face a page like this covered in fairies, it's a little scary. I can take advantage of layers and just break them up. Use a separate layer to draw something I'm unsure of, and delete it without worry. Layers are something I love about working digitally. Decisions can be made multiple times in the same space. I cut up the script, pop the chunks on their pages, then put it down, walk away, come back, and only have to face one spread at a time instead of an entire chapter of text. I get to consider this one part, this snapshot, and think about what's happening. How are we going to portray this? What's the mood? What's the emotion? What's the vibe? How are we going to compose this and communicate it? When I ink, I only have to make decisions regarding one panel, one subject, one thing at a time. I do this in my Muggle life too. It really helps when you have something really large and overwhelming to break it up into little chunks and go through it a little bit at a time, especially if you're an anxious heap like me. Even at my Muggle job, if I have a wall of 15 boxes of little bits of whatever that I have to put away, instead of thinking of all of it and where's it all going to go, I start with one box and one object, and then another object, but always one object at a time. Unless I've had a lot of coffee, and then we just tear through it all and it's no big deal. So anyway, back to the task at hand. I always do my rough drafts in blue. It feels like print-safe blue. So in traditional work, it's paper that's going to be scanned, and you don't always have time or the desire to erase your underdrawing before scanning. It can damage the paper, it can damage the ink, so it's sometimes better just to leave it. And if you're drawing in print-safe blue, and then you ink over it when it's scanned, the scanner, mostly, won't pick it up, unlike pencil scratch marks and eraser dust, as I have found. Did I use blue when I worked traditionally? No, of course not. The blue leads are really soft, and they just snapped constantly. I couldn't draw anything. I had the same problem with Maro pens, but yeah, they would bend and snap whenever I tried to use them because I was so heavy-handed early on. I've gotten better. I've gotten lighter with my hands, but that's not something I have to worry about digitally, hopefully. And at this stage, with the rough draft, I'm not working in any detail, just roughly what information I want where, how Kishu Tankets works in the spread, the camera angles, the direction everyone is facing, how things relate to each other, where the bubbles sit, the size and distance of the figures, and who goes where. What's the flow of the page? What size panels do I need? How many panels will I need? Do I need action panels? Do I need open panels? Sometimes it comes together in like a quick scribble because I can see it in my head. So we've got, circles with crosses in them for faces and just wiggles and some lines for the panels. But sometimes pages fight you and it takes a few rounds. But I just have to keep messing around until it settles down. I even have panels or pages completely change in the inking stage. When I see them with fresh eyes and begin getting into the details and realizing it doesn't work, or at least it doesn't work quite right, and I adjust it. As I mentioned, the rough draft is a good time to put down the text and bubbles, see what space you need and how they interact on the page. They'll likely move, but you have to start somewhere. And luckily, again, this is digital, so we can do that. It's much harder traditionally. So our speech bubbles move and change, and we often have to divide them up during the revision process. Someone is very wordy, so when I have a whole speech that wants to be in one panel, it'll get cut up and spread out. Sometimes onto other panels or other pages, depending on the flow of information, and sometimes we have to make extra panels and pages, though I do try to avoid that when I can. So a lot of words. I mean, a bubble probably wants an average of 10 words in it. So if you've got like 5 times that attached to one moment, one action, it's way too much. It needs editing down or moving around. Beyond text, manga is a visual medium. Make sure as you're making all these decisions that everything is serving the story. You want to be informing, but really you want to be entertaining a reader. You want to capture them and keep them there through the whole story. Each little moment can make or break that. Make sure what's happening is clear, and make sure what's happening is clear. Can we tell what's happening and where to go? I mean, you can have fire art. The characters can be awesome, super lit. But if the layout and composition are bad or not there, maybe everything is a medium side shot, or it's only talking heads. I mean, what's the point? Right? You might as well write a light novel or something. So it's worth training yourself and training your eye to think of the movement and the differences in your panels. Well, okay. Keisha Thinkins. I have a video explaining this if you want to learn about it in more detail, but the TLDR is intro, continue, twist, and reconcile. Generally, I consider the first panel to be key, the introduction, the what the hell is going on page. Set the scene. Where are we? Who is there? Basically, what's happening. In this panel, we see a horde of fairies, Serona, giant, wading past them, lumbering by the little group of Aiden, Kira, Eve, and Puka, who look on in shock and confusion at what just happened on the previous spread or so. And as per the script, Kara looks off panel where she sees Fionn and calls his name. In the following panel, she's overwhelmed by fairies. I wanted to bring the fairy overwhelm in fairly close, but not too much. So we're in that moment with her being overrun. Too close and it becomes more intimate and alludes to an internal thoughts and emotions. At this point, in this moment, we're with her, not within her. Then after the horizontal gutter creates a slight pause, they bite into her. The panel right next to it, with a narrow vertical gutter, we see Aiden as he reacts to this happening and reaches out to her, literally reaching into her panel. I consider these 3 to be shown. It's not a twist, it just shows more of what's happening within our fairy horde. These horrible things are attacking and Aiden reacts. Moving on and up to the top of the next page, we have 10. This is the twist. I feel that page changes can be like a light page turn. There's no reveal really, but you at least have the surprise of new information or a change of perspective or something. And because you have that slight delay of the reader's eyes going from the bottom of the page up to the top, it's tiny, but for me, it's enough. These spikes that were introduced in Chapter 5 return and impale that wretched fairy in the back as it tears into Kara's coat and shoulder. And because it's something the reader has already seen, I'm hoping they'll recognize what's happening before we've had to tell them. And then, of course, the next 2 panels into the cuts, we confirm what's happening and reveal that, in fact, Aiden's magic has returned and he can more effectively fight the fairies, who are now quite scared instead of just rabid. The dynamic of the group has changed. The fairies are no longer just intimidating, they are intimidated. Once the rough is done, and hopefully has been checked by Lotti, I whip out another layer and delete at my leisure. Scribble, mess things up, do another rough. Doesn't really matter. This is a good figuring out layer. And I tend to do this layer in pink. Why is it pink? I don't know. I just went with it, and it's easier to see against the blue and feels less final and precious than black. Sometimes I'll do a cleaner, fine-tuned finishing layer in black over the pink, but I didn't need to in this page, and especially not with the fairies. I'm not drawing them twice. Once is enough. Sometimes I lose track of what layer I'm on. Who doesn't do that? Who here doesn't lose track of their layers? So in this case, the fairies, part of a fairy is on pink, part of a fairy is black. What is going on? What is going on? I don't know. But I'll flatten it down. So my line work layer ends up being together as one layer, so I can use it as a reference layer for toning. Okay, let's go back to the fairy carrot page. The video, the time lapse is gonna keep doing what it's doing, but I want to go a little more panel by panel and talk about it, take some tangents. So when I hit the page, where do I start? I said earlier that I just pick a thing. So I just picked a thing. Something that's manageable, something easy, it's approachable, easy to conquer, and then move on. Rather than being weighed down by an entire page. So here, apparently, it was a good day for teeth. I can handle that. Some juicy fangs, I got this. So I started there. Then moving to the ears. I have a harder time with ears for some reason than the hair, the moss, etc., etc. But I'm not thinking about the entire panel at this point. Just one fairy at a time. If I have to think of the whole thing, I'm going to freak out. So I just go one at a time and then add Kara in the center. I started Kara's face in a separate layer than the fairies. It helps me figure out how they're going to physically interact, because I'm not sure. And I've got my fairy drawing. I don't want to ruin it. And I try to work this panel to completion before moving on, even adding the frame and cleaning it up and finishing out. It gives me a sense of completion. I've conquered something. It gives a little more confidence to move on. Many mangaka like to use Clip Studio's frame templates, where each panel is in a different layer below. The panels are already laid out for you. The gutters are in place on a separate layer. But I woke up and chose violence, so I drew them myself. I'm picky, and I'm not always sure to the end where I want the panels. It sometimes changes. I find the templates too restricting. Sometimes I will later decide to change the frame shape or delete it altogether and have an open panel. I'll get to the end of the page and think, yeah, these panels need to be different. The flow is wrong. So I work from a blank page and sort my layers from there. Little note for her hair. I've found that if I block in the shape of the hair and then add little wisps, it gives it a more dynamic feel. Here her hair was giving me a little trouble, but that's okay. It always does. So, okay, the next panel. What can I conquer and not freak out? Throughout this process, we're just reducing the stress of each decision by separating them and breaking them down. Oh, backgrounds. I tend not to use brushes for my backgrounds, just like the frames. Maybe I'm old, I'm fussy, I like to do them myself. I like having that control. But while working on earlier chapters of this location, I was in severe burnout and was really busy. I had multiple projects going at the same time, and I also wanted it to look otherworldly, so I tried some pre-made image brushes. Generally, I find them to be stiff, lifeless, repetitive. There's a lack of organic spontaneity, and it's obvious that it's a brush. Especially where it's the same tree over and over, which these were. I ended up using at least 4 different tree brushes because of that. So anyway, in this instance, I gave it a go for time, for sanity, and to make it look odd compared to the hand-drawn landscape I'd done up to this point. And the fog, which was just a cloud brush with a lowered transparency, was initially to cover the flatness a little bit. It's the same cloud brush I used in the beach scenes or any shots of the house and the ocean. It's a really great brush. It looks really good. But anyway, I used it for fog, made it really big, made it transparent, and used it to cover the flatness and to create a barrier between the foreground and the background. Because if you've got a black background, black hair, black sleeves, if you're Puka, a black suit, it's going to be really difficult to parcel that out. So sometimes necessity dictates choice, and you have to creatively continue expressing your story through those restrictions. So the background is on one layer, then the fog, then the foreground line art. In between the fog and the foreground, I'll add another layer. Set the line out layer to reference layer with the little lighthouse. Select the panel so we're only working in that space, and paint bucket the whole thing. On a separate layer, not on the line art layer. Don't lose your line art. And then paint bucket delete where the background would be. So the white is behind the line art layer and the foreground stands out. And it creates a clean surface for the tones, which I'll also paint bucket. And I tend to do the tones last and slot them below the line art, so we'll get to those later. Over time, the fog came to symbolize the power in this other world, in Granis's garden. Its ability to suppress magic and outside power. So in upcoming chapters, Lotti wants the fog to completely dissipate. But really, I can only reduce it and do some background trickery to maintain the affirmation separation and layering. But like everything else, we'll figure it out, use the restriction to come up with something cooler. So, but, you know, we'll get to that. We'll make that decision then. As I keep saying, I don't want to make all these decisions at once. So I'll put them off as long as I can get away with and tackle them a little bit at a time. And really, it's something I've found kind of fun as we've gone along, how some of these restrictions and the artwork itself can affect and shift the story. If your writer is amenable to that and the story is ongoing and things are a little flexible. I don't know if it's the art giving the writer a different perspective on the story from outside their head, or maybe giving them new ideas, new questions. I'd be curious to know. Maybe I should ask Lotti. But Scatheless was originally supposed to be 6 chapters, and now there's 20. I think it's going to be 24 or so in total. Puka and Kale weren't entire characters early on either. But as they came to life on the page, and I put a little bit of me in them and had fun with it, they were incorporated, given their own story, and have their own things to say. I think Kale's personality seems to come out of the art rather than the writing. But she works with it and has really fleshed him out. I really appreciate how flexible she is. It really frees me up to explore her characters and share them with her instead of just drawing them for her. Oh, and one of the corrections for this page was including Puka in the first panel. I had completely forgotten about him. So after the corrections, when I was working on them, it was late, I was tired, Mr. Zen was monologuing at me, so I rushed to finish and lazily copy-pasted him from another panel and sent it to Lotti. And she was like, "Was ist das? What is this? He doesn't look like that yet." Yeah, great. I don't work in order, so I just forget. But we had literally talked about it the day before, so my bad. So she suggested I drew his dog rabbit self, and it worked out much better. And I ended up having to edit out Aiden's sleeve in order to fit him in. It just wasn't going to work any other way. But I'm glad he's there, so they're all there together. And I'll add the screenshot of the final corrected page at the end of the video. So stick around and see how it turns out. Oh, look, Aiden. Theoretically, when drawing a face, I start with the eyebrows. It came from, in Manben, the episode about the artist of Galgro 13. He has these massive eyebrows, and he talks about drawing them first and using it to set the structure of the face. So in my mind, that's what I do, but in watching this time lapse, it's not true at all. The face does need an anchor point for the features to be arranged correctly. Apparently, sometimes I start with the eyebrows, sometimes with the eyes, sometimes with the ears. When I draw eyes, I draw them both at the same time. Don't complete one beautiful eye and then start the other, and you've got this wibbly circle that just, it ain't working. So do them together. Sometimes they end up too high and I need to scoot them down. Western faces tend to have a longer mid palette. So if your eyes are too high, it'll look like Western cartoon art more than anime somehow. Just something I've noticed. So if you drop the eyes, it shortens and widens the face a little bit and reduces the nose. And I think Asian, or at least Japanese women, tend to have a lower nose and eye set anyway. Something to play with. But in the end, I feel like it's a shortcut that makes faces look a little more generically anime manga, which are necessarily Asian. And at some point I was reading about beauty standards and faces in different races. And apparently there's something about beautiful or attractive female face structure, and anime and manga artists seem to draw this a lot. It's especially a okay. I remember at some point reading about facial structure in different races, and went on to read about beauty standards in different countries, different races. And there's something about attractive female faces that their structure, anime and manga artists seem to draw a lot in my observation, and sometimes even for the male characters too. It's a sort of baby-like facial structure. Larger eyes, smaller nose, larger forehead, small jaw and chin. I mean, what does that sound like to you? I randomly go on deep dives looking at this sort of thing, like, you know, the structures of different faces. And then when I am watching and reading, I notice those things, and it's kind of fun. Like, oh, that's what's happening. And even sometimes different languages and different countries and different races, people, when talking to each other, will concentrate on different parts of the face, whether it's the nose, the mouth, or the eyes. And then when artists from that place or that country, region, race, when they draw, it comes through. There's a focus on the nose, there's a focus on the mouth, there's a focus on the eyes. A lot of, in my observation, Japanese art enhances the eyes and plays down the nose and mouth. Their language is different. There's more, you rely more on context and body language, whereas in the West, using English, it's more about the words and the intonation, so there's a focus on the mouths. So a lot of Western, in my observation, a lot of Western manga art will have a focus on the mouths more than the eyes, or even the nose. Anyway, tangent. I love to tangent. Where did I go? Okay. So yeah, all that to say, dropping the eyes will shorten the nose, and don't forget Japanese faces don't really have a brow structure. That's Asian skulls have a smaller brow usually. But make sure your ears are still in the right place. They don't really change. Top of your ear is about your eye or brow. The lobe of your ear is about your mouth, or so, about like here. And if you stick your ears up here, maybe it looks like you're looking down. If you put your ears down here, maybe it looks like you're looking up. So keep that in mind. I've seen weird combinations where people put the ears down here and the faces is straight on, and it's very strange. I've not seen a human with ears down here. So the ears should hang out with the nose. And watching this, it looks like I gave up on Aiden's eyes and started with his ears and then went back to draw the eyes. Why is the second eye always so tough to draw? I will conquer it. And apparently mouths on these pages give me a hard time. I mean, what does a mouth look like anyway? What does a screaming anime mouth look like? I'm not sure. I'm not always sure. I definitely had to pause this recording and look up a million screaming anime manga faces to reference a decent mouth at this angle somehow. And then I fill in his hair, add some wispies, give him some movement. With his hand, you get to see one of the decisions I've been talking about. This time I drew a hand versus a stick figure. I had a particular idea in mind of what I wanted it to look like. But then when it came to ink, it wasn't quite right. Well, what does a hand even look like at this angle? I mean, if I had hands, I could look at them anytime. So, sucks for me, I guess. But I'm not considering the entire panel at this moment. I have to sort out this hand. What does it look like? Can I make it convincing enough? I reference a lot for this. Always reference. Some people are against referencing, and I don't know why. Maybe they confuse it with tracing, which is not the same thing. At tracing, you're just, lighting something from behind and drawing over it. Not a whole lot of thought goes into that. But if you're referencing, you're having to look at something, process what you're seeing, and translate it into what you're drawing. And you kind of have to train your eyes so you can draw what you see, what you actually see, not what you think you see. So like a hand, you're not just drawing your concept of a hand loosely. You're looking at this image and seeing what are the forms of, what is the shape of this thing that we're calling a hand right now. And the fingers were giving me fits, so because it's digital, I can moosh them around until they make sense, and that's something I love about digital. You can scoot stuff around until it's where you want it. As he's reaching out for Kara, I decided to have him coming out of his panel, reaching into hers, but I kept his frame. At some point, I delete her frame. I felt the panel needed to be more open, more exposed and vulnerable, whereas he, in contrast, is trapped in his little box, trying to break out and reach for her. And then I'll add all his dirt. I often forget the dirt, his beard, and Fiona and Eve's freckles. During the review, we always have a freckle and beard check, but Lotti has a eagle eye for that sort of thing, thankfully. In adding in his background, he's at a Dutch angle, off kilter, making it slightly off balance and uneasy. I, once again, prefer to hand draw these action lines. It feels more organic and natural to me. But I'm not a monster, so I'll take the ruler tool and use it on the blue layer put the lines where I want them, get them nice and straight, and draw over them on the final layer in different thicknesses. I mean, you can use the speedline presets. There's brushes for it, but once again, I'm picky and I want it to look like how I want, not what the tool wants, and I want it in my hand. Also, I have the luxury of time, and most pro mangaka don't have that, so they use a lot of presets. If you see a lot of photos, assets, tools, presets, tracing, they have no time. They have what, 4 days to make 12 pages? No, 20 pages. 4 days to make 20 pages. That's insane. How is it even possible? I don't know. So anyway, top left panel. Focus. In the top left panel, I apparently decided the glass spikes were the least threatening and the easiest place to start, and then filled in the fairy around them. God damn it. Ugh, I'm so itchy. Itchy! Okay, focus. The top left panel. Ugh, I'm itchy! So the top left panel, I apparently decided the glass spikes were the least threatening and easiest place to start. Then I can start filling the fairy in around them. While working on all of these little monsters, I had the fairy from chapter 1 pulled up, so I didn't have to make each fairy up as I went along. I could use it as reference. So roots around the ears, arms, different parts of the body, moss on the face, moss on the body, stringy moss on the head, raw, open, gross eye holes, raw, torn around the mouth instead of lips. They have no lips. Gnashing teeth and leaves when I remember the leaves. They're skinny, they're emaciated, and their corners are pointy and unnerving. For this guy in the rough draft, I hadn't decided what to do with his arms. I mean, why decide then when I can figure it out later and make later me deal with it? I decided it was letting go when it was impaled and tore a bit out of her shoulder and jacket. So I had to look at flailing arms, and where was she in these flailing arms? Where's her hair? I wanted her hair over the arms, so it looked like they were kind of entangled a little bit, but it made her hair too long, so never mind. I always draw her hair too long. Lotti notices that too. Her eyes. She's got those German eyes. She sees everything. So again, with these little spikes, I reference back to chapter 5 for the last time this exact thing happened. I had drawn in these little whoosh lines, so I add them here. I want it to look as much like the panel in chapter 5 as possible without copying it exactly. It's a reference back. I want the reader to recognize it. They've seen it before, bringing it up again, so that in that moment they understand what just happened or why it just happened before I have to explicitly tell them, which will be in the next panel. I feel like it's more satisfying when your reader puts things together first before you have to tell them. Really good setup and foreshadowing can do this for you. And where you're suddenly like, oh, that's what's happening here. And then it turns around and tells you when you're like, yep, that's what happened. And I often have to go back through old chapters for references and consistency. Some people make character sheets and hang them on their walls so that they know all the details at a glance. Not me. I'm not that smart. So I have to dig back through the chapters and see what past me did, what on earth I was thinking 2 years ago. Oh look, more background. It's pretty formulaic at this point. Hatching brush, tree brush, bush brush, fog. Okay, moving on to Aiden and Eve. This would be one of the Ketsu panels where we let you know what's going on. See, I think I draw eyebrows first, but this time I did them last. Whenever I try to draw shocked faces, Aiden's face is supposed to be shocked, I understand why Oda-sensei creates these increasingly extreme, completely ridiculous faces that are completely abstracted. The features, especially the eyes, never feel like I can get them wide enough. At least not to convince me it's like, these are maximum width, and I want them to look even more scared. There's probably other bodily language that I'm missing, so I'm leaning on the eyes too much. But that's neither here nor there. Once again, I'm messing with the arm to get it where I want it and the right size. He may be small, but we don't want any baby hands here. I love drawing hands. Many people don't like hands or feet and avoid them. Don't avoid them. You're really missing out. Once you get used to the way the parts of a hand relate to each other and the gross movements, they become a second face and expand your ability to express emotion. Feet too, though I find they tend to express intent more than emotion, but maybe still a little. I mean, if you're talking to someone, maybe you're going in depth about your special interest and their feet are turned away. They're not into it and they went out. Conversely, if, you're around someone and they have their feet pointed at you, they're interested in interacting with you. It's a fun little body language thing. Anyway, when I position my fingers, I still struggle with the thumb, but if you look at your outstretched hand, you'll notice generally your index and middle finger hang out together, while the other two are kind of off doing their own thing, especially the pinky. It's trying to escape. And at the bottom, the creases where your fingers join your palm, and indeed on the back, the creases like point in one particular direction, I guess. In this case, towards my pinky. It's a little detail. Maybe that's too much detail, but if you get comfortable with the form of your hand, you find it easier to sketch the expressions, but not necessarily the high detail. Unless you want to add little details like those creases to just give a more real feel without getting into insane high detail. And I remember when I noticed hands had nails in manga art. I'm like, what? What? Hands have nails? When did that happen? Who knew? I suppose I should draw that. And I found it made my hands look a little more convincing somehow. And less like gloves. So some details are good to include, even if your art is pretty abstracted, because, well, it's a cartoon, basically. But the reader will still subconsciously pick up on things. I mean, we look at hands, eyes, and bodies all the time. We know what they do and don't look like. Whether we realize it or not, we have an intimate knowledge of their details and what's on them. So it can make it feel more familiar to your reader. So it can be a useful tool to lean on. Trust the common knowledge of your reader as a shortcut. Don't overdo it and get too lazy, and don't use it like a crutch. But it can be good to use it a little bit. I mean, I think in a previous video, I used a toothbrush as an example. Hopefully, seeing that, a reader would know what's going on, maybe have some clue. I mean, you don't have to explain every little thing. So sometimes use that common knowledge. I've seen things, especially in amateur manga, even Japanese too, not just Western or something, where they would go into depths explaining things that did not need explaining, and it was too much and weird and kind of took me out of the story, and I hightailed it out of there. So Eve's face was really giving me a hard time. I mean, what does a face look like? Her cheek, like no matter what I did, looked big and puffy and swollen. Female faces in general tend to be softer and more round, whereas male faces generally are more angular. And I even remembered her freckles. Go me. And I think her hair gets bigger and wilder the more I draw it. More curls, more flyaways, just more. But, you know, the bigger the hair, the closer to God, right? And I swear, Aiden's sleeves are a creature unto themselves. In the real world version of this jacket, the sleeves are open and loose like that. You can tie them close underneath, but often they're just left open. Though I don't think they flap around quite as much as Aiden's do. But, you know, it gives the panel more energy and dynamism than if they just laid flat all the time. And in this pair of panels, instinctually, I'll admit, his flying sleeves lay in such a way as to zigzag you through the image and down to the next panel. You come from Kara's arm in the top panel, down Aiden's sleeve to his face, then down his arm to the fairy, and the fairy in the back of the bottom panel to the fairy in the front, and then onto the fairy in the left. It just takes you down to the bottom panel. It's fun to play with using art in this way, to guide the reader from bubble to bubble or panel to panel, especially Western readers who aren't as accustomed to the reading direction. I'm finding younger kids are, because they've been reading manga and they're used to it, but the older your readers are, the harder a time they have. So the easier you can make it for them, the better, right? You know, you want them to have a smooth experience and keep reading, keeping entertained. So that said, you don't really want to place your speech bubbles arbitrarily. If you can help it, they should work with your imagery. I mean, they're part of the imagery, almost a character of their own. But they alone won't guide your reader through, necessarily. Same with the panels. I mean, if you have two sets of bubbles in panels next to each other, they're at the same level, neighboring panels, which do you read first? And technically the one on the right, because that's the reading direction. But you've created the situation where your reader is stopped. They're out of the story. They're like, which way do I go? You know, and they have to think about it. You don't want them to have to think about it. And they may have to read it multiple times. So you gotta be careful with that. Even if you just slightly drop one, so it informs them that, okay, you go to this side first. Help push them through the page the right way, the way that you want them to go. Careful placement of frames and speech bubbles, as well as the composition of the art, will lead the reader through. And ideally, they won't realize it. They'll just go on the path that you have opened up for them, which really is your job. Take them by the hand, and you guide them through the story. And not every page, not every panel is going to be like this, where it's overtly zigzagged in an obvious path, but it's something to keep in mind for the underlying structure, the rough draft, and the composition and the layout. The composition, the layout, the bubble placement, panel placement, gutters, it all works together to do the heavy lifting. And after a while, you'll likely do it instinctively. And since working in this direction, I get confused by left to right comics. Occasionally, Mr. Zen will send me a little webcomic in amongst his many memes, and it will take me a few goes to read it correctly, especially if the composition and layout is kind of lazy and doesn't take the time to tell me where to start. I often have to find the punchline and work backwards and then read it again, and a joke can be ruined that way. Your payoff relies on the correct setup, so if it's unclear, then it's gone. It's lost. Others that are better composed, I get at a glance. I read it without thinking because it's been laid out that way. It's funny for me watching the fairies being drawn so fast at this 1000% speed. I wish it was this fast all the time. Having the base set of principles for designing the fairies does take off some of the stress in drawing them. I'm not confronted by reinventing the wheel for each fairy. I can set them up and knock them down. Being that they're just principles, I can rearrange and change them up so they're not just carbon copies. They're not a brush. We don't have a fairy brush. and it makes it more organic. I can decide in the moment where to put everything, but if I'm overwhelmed or pressed for time, I can just rotely fill them in until it comes together on its own, like do all the ear roots, do a bunch of arm roots, so on and so forth. And face moss. Apparently this one has a beard. Oh. I remembered the leaves. This one has leaves. The original one had more warts, scaly skin, and grossness, but here I'm just giving a suggestion of that, if I remember. And sometimes a thicker pen for the moss takes up more space and speeds things up, like I did here. When switching to digital, I tried to find a brush that mimicked what I was doing on paper. It took some experimenting, and this particular brush, it ended up being 5.3 is too small, and if a panel is small, 4 point is good for the face details. On a rough draft, I might do 10 so that I'm not tempted to go wild and get into really tight detail. And these days I keep my canvases small. So this spread is actually book size. The pages are A5. Technically, it's better to make your manga pages on B4. That's the traditional side pro manga is made at. That's the size of deleter paper and the size of paper manga could use. And then it's shrunk down to book size, even the tiny little books. And when shrunk down, your line work looks much finer, much cleaner, smoother, and than when it's, at the right size like mine. And it's also, especially if you're working on paper, easier to draw detail on that larger paper. Digitally, you can zoom in until the sun burns out and the cows come home, and it's not really an issue. You can zoom and zoom and zoom and zoom. Which is why I work with physical pen size, physical paper size, because it stops me from zooming in too much. And because of the way that I work like that, before was just, digitally anyway, it was just way too big. Way too big. I would spend forever in a day adding impossibly fine detail and hatching that no one will see. That doesn't matter. And it took way too long. So I decided to try smaller pages, even to the point where anything over 300 DPI, which is print resolution, is too big. Some early chapters of Scatheless have extra detail, some extra fine work, because I was accidentally working at 350 and I forgot to adjust it down to 300. You don't want to go any lower than 300 because you can't print it. So don't go lower than that. Don't expect to be able to print any lower than 300. It's just going to look terrible. And I don't even look at 600. Plenty of people use it, but for me and my computer, it's way too much. If a page feels like it's taking forever, and that's considering these two pages took 6 hours each. So it's like 8 hours, 10 hours, days and days on one page. I'm like, what's going on? This feels hard. And it's just that I have too much space. It's too big, and it's probably 350. So after some cursing and sadness, I'll adjust it and the other chapters so things run much smoother. So my pen is a physical size, my paper is a physical size. What you see is what I see. And I personally find that more reasonable. I'm okay with it being a little rough. Even the pen I use is rough. And in this case, especially as Lotti decided to get Aiden extremely dirty, and he stayed dirty, I was hoping when Aiden was healed and brought back to life, his clothes would be clean and his bratana or cloak would come back. I miss drawing it. Like in anime where your clothing is part of you, part of your character, and I suppose an expression of your well-being. So when you're healed and refreshed, your clothes magically reappear, all fixed and good as new. But no such luck for me. Dirt forever. Don't get me wrong, I think he looks good dirty, and it's appropriate in the story, but, you know, it's a lot of hatching, and I tend to forget it, especially in this chapter. And again, I work out of order, so I kept forgetting his dirt. He would be dirty, magically clean. Dirty, magically clean. And Lotti pointed it out. I'm like, okay. I went back and fixed it, of course. And as for the hatching itself, I've seen and tried different techniques that are out there. It's, you know, worth watching those and trying them. But then after a while of just doing it over and over, I mean, lions can only go in so many directions. I guess I developed my own chaotic technique. Slotting in the background again. I added more white around the fairies so you can see them, and they don't just dissolve into the background and the dissipating fog. They're shaking. They're finally scared, and they should be, those little monsters. I clean it up, add the frame, and it's about ready to go. Then I drop down all the line art into one layer. Oh, nope, one more panel. And it's a fairy panel, of course. And of course I left it for last. I ended up scooting the impaled fairy over to the left a little bit. I wanted the page to kind of lean to the left and nudge the reader to the page turn. Again, we've come down from Aiden's sleeve and arm into these two fairies, one in the back, one in the front, pulling you in and over to the injured fairy, hopefully. And I find it easier to just delete the rough layer as I go. Once this recording was finished, I took a screenshot because by the end I was like, oh, whoops, snap, I don't have a rough draft layer to show at the end, and, you know, and side by side with the finished version so you could see where we started and where we ended up. And that's kind of why I don't tend to post before and after on social media, because I delete the layer and I forget. Blood. With this panel sped up, you can really see the fairy formula being set up and knocked down. I mean, unless there's a fairy that's being focused on and I have to go back and make sure they match themselves, I just go along drawing and oops, I forget. I forgot the leaves again. If I remember right, I think I looked up references for the poses of the two fairies on the left. Mostly because they're doing specific things. One is crouching and they're grabbing each other and they're scared. I mean, I'm not going to find the perfect photo that captures two scared fairies grabbing each other. But I can find multiple photos that I'll take bits from. So I'm probably looking for someone crouching, someone grabbing an arm, someone looking to the side, because I'm not going to find it all together. So I looked them up separately. I mean, what is crouching? What is grabbing? What do bodies look like anyway? Having good Google foo really comes into play here as you look for puzzle pieces and somehow train your algorithm. Is that a thing? I mean, I think mine is trained at this point and has a decent pose finding game. So if you're looking for someone crouching, grabbing an arm, looking to the side, you're not going to find it. So often when I'm looking for these puzzle pieces, most of the search results will be commercially done clip art-like photos with the white background and people in business suits pretending to do things. You know, like, oh, I'm slipping on an orange peel or whatever. And I struggle with those because of how fake they are. I prefer to find authenticity where I can find it. What does an action, emotion, or response really look like? What does your body really do? And some stuff is, you know, naturally difficult and impossible to find, so you kind of have to get creative with your searches. I'm not going to find a photo of someone being bitten by a gross fairy, but maybe a dog, or a police dog, even. What about falling from a height? I've found plenty of images of people jumping from windows or falling from buildings. more than I would think. What about discovering the dead body of someone familiar to you, like, or even someone close to you, like Puka finding Aiden. And after a lot of searching, the referencing stage takes a long time. But eventually I found photos from the aftermath of bombings in the country of Georgia. And this particular selection of photos showed people moving bodies. And it had someone who discovered someone they knew, maybe it was a sibling or a friend, and they were hugging them and distressed, crying, everything. So I used that to inform the frame of Puka finding Aiden. And weirdly, I feel the same about hugs. There are different kinds of hugs depending on what the moment is, what the emotion is, who is hugging who, what's happening. But real ones, not fake stock photo hugs that are always stiff and awkward and say nothing. So it can help you to think around what you're looking for or what you want to communicate to the reader, as if you couldn't use words and you could only use images, like in the SMA. I love how the SMA really forces you to do that. With stock photos, the feeling is just wrong. The subtlety is wrong, the intent is wrong, the emotion is wrong. But if I'm looking for a pose or an angle and I'm having trouble finding it in a natural photo or video, I'll resort to the stock photos, but I don't think it. Whenever I can find footage of people, actors or regular people doing things, having an emotion or a reaction, I want to see what people actually do. If you're scared, how do you react? What do you do with your hands? And it's part of communicating with your reader, making it easier to understand. The chances are you've seen these actions and reactions before or done them yourself with all the subtleties and have an unconscious knowledge of body language, facial expressions, and such in your daily life. So if you see that on a page, it clues you in a little bit to what's going on. Bad fakery can break the immersion and clarity of communication and just not say anything. This makes me think of Hannibal, which I've been binge watching recently. Apparently for the role of Dr. Lecter, Mads Mikkelsen actually learned to cook the way he does in the show. And he actually cooks in the show. And he said it was because he wanted it to be convincing and believable, which enhances the immersion. And it tells you a lot more about the nature of the character than if they were to do basic fake cooking or slick camera shots just to suggest what's happening, or him saying, yeah, I love to cook. And that's the end of it. And I swear, at least at the beginning when they're setting up his character, so much of the show seems to focus on the senses, sensuality, and mouths and eating, which is a great way to serve a story about a cannibal, really. So, anyway, these fairies are not about what's happening, and we've got a lolling tongue. You gotta have a lolling tongue. I think that's one of my favorite things about the fairy queen, her constantly lolling tongue. I don't know that makes her any scarier, but it entertains me, which I wholeheartedly support. I mean, I say it's about the reader, but really it's about me. I'm joking, it's about the reader. The fairy reveal in chapter 1 was fairly meticulously planned out and set up. I tried to set things up a few pages before, having Fionn going from the familiar, well-lit, safe place, the pub, into a progressively smaller, darker, narrower, more confining space. Many of the panels have a very slight Dutch angle to make them feel off-kilter and uneasy. There may be several panels that you can't tell that they're tilted, they just don't feel right, which is on purpose. I wanted it to be subtle enough that you don't necessarily see what's happening, but it feels off and you feel uncomfortable. And then, of course, the old Junji Ito trick of the final panel in the corner being a reaction to what has been seen, to the scare. So you are left to decide if you even want to turn the page and at what speed you receive that reveal. I've heard from several people it actually gave them a jump, so I'm happy with that. And the creature is actually eating a puppy. This is one of the things we had disagreements about in the beginning. Lotti rightfully felt it was an easy scare and uncomfortable. To me, it felt kind of cheap and cheesy, almost comical, and it would focus on the puppy, especially with the setup. We were going to have lost dog posters as Fiona's walking through the city and end with this gross monstrosity eating a puppy. And I can see where she's coming from, and yeah, we're gonna get a shock out of readers when they see this cute thing being defiled, but I think many of us are desensitized to stuff like that now, and to violence. I mean, we've all seen a lot in movies and on TV, and I think it wouldn't come across the way it was intended. I mean, the intent of the trick will probably show through, and it could easily be a little heavy-handed, making it obvious and diminishing the effect. But in compromise, the concept stayed. The puppy stayed. But I played it down a bit so we could focus on Fiona and the fairy and have that be the scare rather than the action of the puppy being eaten and the horror of it. Fortunately, or unfortunately, it turned out a little difficult to see what is being eaten by this grotesque aberration. But if you look closely, there are toe beans in there, and that's your clue. Maybe it's too subtle, but too late now. So at the script establishing stage, I'll take the time to decide where those page turns are, if any, and how to lead up to them. And sometimes page turns are just useful for scene changes, but they can be good for punchlines, twists, little surprises, or of course, a big reveal. The impact can be enhanced by a dull page, sucking you in, and like a idiot, you're dumb enough to turn the page, and then pow, you're punched in the face by whatever is next. The fairies on this panel have a lot of leaves and ribs. They're gross. I like to make them look emaciated, and I reference that too. Not directly, but enough to imitate the look. I mean, I don't find a skeleton picture or use my friend over here that you can't see because he's off camera and carefully place each rib. I might do that for something important or a large image where I can add a lot of detail. But for something small like this, I might look up skinny anorexic people, mostly skinny men, because you can look at the front and back of the rib cage and not have breasts to worry about, unless that's part of your image. My search history, I tell you, I'm on a list somewhere. I've got to be. Some of the stuff you look up as a creative or an artist, like, it can get dark. Mostly from wanting that authenticity and the experience, the visual experience of a scary or intense moment, or showing your character actually experiencing, like when you get hit or stabbed. What does that look like? How does your body actually react? What do wounds look like? And even if you're not copying an image directly, you're being informed and have a sense of what it looks like and feels like, so you can effectively communicate it to another human being who may or may not have seen the same thing. Hopefully not for the dark stuff. Okay, we made it to toning. I generally do this last and have a somewhat lazy approach to tones. When I was doing my research early on of what manga could do, many of the shonen artists use very few tones, often just one or two. Perhaps due to time or the expense of physical tones. And I mean, they've only recently gone digital. Depending on the genre, some people like to tone really intensely, and others barely at all. I've found over time I prefer to only use one or two tones, perhaps a gradient. If I pick a tone for clothing, I'll stick with it throughout. I'll use it like this fairy to separate the foreground from the background and define the plane of something, and define the plane of an image or an emotion. Like in an extremely close-up face, being toned may make it feel internal, or conversely, having only the background toned, not the face, has a different feel. The entire thing being flat-toned may be a stab of realization rather than a thought. It's not color. Tone is not color. They're value and emotion, which is different, and I think a more versatile tool than just coloring things in black and white to be as lifelike as possible. We see that all the time. This is cartooning and abstraction. You can do more than that. So last consideration. Once I essentially have the inking and toning done, I go back over it and consider the spread as a whole again. See what's missing or if I forgot something. If you find that something isn't right, upsets the flow, or feel, this is when you can correct it, because yay, digital. One panel in, I think, chapter 6 or so, when they're defending the house. Aiden is riding horse Puka, and in one panel, probably from referencing too closely, I should have looked up a small child and a large horse. He was too big, and Puka was too small. Especially considering Aiden is 4 foot and change, and Puka is based on a Shire horse, which is over 6 foot at the shoulder, so it made no sense. It broke immersion, and it didn't feel right. Lotti pointed it out too, it just was weird. So I, selected around him, reduced him down, and filled everything in. It's not a difficult change. If that was ink, that'd been a lot of whiteout or starting over. The top Serona panel, I guess, needed more grabby hands in this sea of bobbing heads. There were places where the white layer hadn't erased fully and needed to be cleaned up. I thickened Aiden's outline to kind of add to his stuck feeling. I enjoy the thicker outline, but I always forget to do it. Where like the outline of the silhouette of the character is outlined, where the silhouette of the character is thick and then all the internal lines are thin. But I never remembered to do it, so I guess I'm not that attached to it. I played with it in Saros a little bit, but that was all drawn traditionally, and my physical inking is a lot more clumsy and heavy-handed than in digital, so it just looked wrong. It was bulky and weird, and it didn't flow. It's easier in digital, which is more like pencil for me somehow. These tech bubbles I actually add. They're not in the script. Sometimes once drawn, it feels like someone is saying something that isn't there. It's happened a few times, actually. I'll add something in if I can hear it, and she can change it, or I'll leave it and she'll notice and add something. And honestly, it's nice not being the writer for this because, well, that's her problem, not mine. So if we had to add more text, sometimes she's like, I don't know, put in something like this or that maybe, whatever. And it's like, sorry, well, you get to decide that. That's your particular problem. You just let me know and I'll add it in. But, she's good for it. She's a good sport. And then we have our end result. So here we are, the messy blue rough draft and the adjusted finished end result. I don't generally see the end result in the rough draft, and obviously you never see them together, but it's kind of fun now seeing them side by side or one after the other. And if you made it this far to the end of the video, thank you. I really appreciate you spending the time with me. It was actually a lot of fun to watch this time lapse and talk about it. And if this is something you'd like more of, let me know. Put it down in the comments, and I'd be more than happy to record more of these and talk about them. And as I said at the top, I'm planning on doing this with the rough draft coming up, going from blank page all the way to blue scribbles. So watch out for that, and I'll see you then.